Hey, Lisa, would you mind just confirming that your microphone is working okay?
Sure. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Great. Thank you so much.
Sure.
And Lisa, will you need me to change presenter mode for you to share slides? Nope.
Yep, that's all right.
So you won't have any slides then? Is that
No slides.
okay? Thank you for confirming.
Of course.
Giving folks a few minutes to keep joining. And thanks again for agreeing to participate, Lisa.
Sure.
I see it is 3 o'clock. It looks like we only have about a dozen folks, and I know that we had quite a few more registrations, so I may just give another moment or two before we kick it off. But thank you all for joining. And this meeting is being recorded as well. Just want to make sure that is stated up front. Given that it's recorded, for folks who may be joining late, suppose they can always watch the recording. So yeah, I think we can maybe go ahead and get things kicked off. And actually, let me see if I can get my mic and camera situated a little bit better. One moment. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So welcome everyone to the May Open Government National Action Plan public meeting. We have a couple minor updates from our last meeting as we prepare to formally kick off the co-creation process. And then we also have civil society guest, Lisa Rosenberg, to provide some perspectives from her organization and the coalition of other organizations working in this open government space. And let me share my slides. Sorry, one moment here. All right, can everyone see my screen? I lost my dual monitors are not working for me today right now. Sorry about this. Okay. Pause. I'm sharing. Sorry for the technical difficulties, folks. I can't see anyone else at the moment, I guess, for whatever reason while I am sharing, but let's see if I can work this out. But in any case, let me start over. All right, so I am Phil Ashlock. Thank you for joining us today for the May public meeting for the U.S. Open Government National Action Plan. Our agenda here is do some quick welcome intros and then provide some updates on the co-creation process for the new U.S. Open Government National Action Plan. Then we will hear from Lisa Rosenberg from Open the Government about the blueprint for accountability, and then we'll get into a little bit more on next steps for the co-creation process. So with that, like I said, I am Phil Ashlock. I am coming to you from the General Services Administration, where I'm providing support across the interagency and to several White House offices to support this process. And I believe I have some colleagues from the White House as well. AMAC Alex, I don't know if you or others would like to say hello. For some reason, I can't see anyone else right now. So,
I'll just say howdy. Nice to see you all.
Thanks, Alex. And let's go ahead. All right, so just about 2 weeks ago, we posted the co-creation plan for creating the new National Action Plan. The whole process for putting out this co-creation plan is defined by the Open Government Partnership standards, which we heard about at the last meeting. And that also stipulates having a 2-week period to post that co-creation plan before the co-creation process officially begins. So the link for that co-creation plan is here. And as I shared at our meeting before, this is the sort of general overview of the timeline for the co-creation process. And so we are still right at the beginning in May. So the plan was officially published on May 6th. We were maybe a few days late. I think we're hoping to get it out in April, but and so that means that the co-creation process officially begins tomorrow, May 20th. I was hoping the timing would work out such that this meeting would coincide with that, but we are coinciding with Open Government Week. So hope you're all enjoying Open Government Week and all the events happening here and elsewhere. But tomorrow there will be updates on the open.usa.gov website, where this first phase, this outreach phase, will really kick into gear. And so just to recap, the purpose of this first outreach phase is really to do much more proactive outreach with relevant civil society organizations, communities, experts, stakeholders, the general public, and for us to do much more of the communications and outreach to bring more people into the process, and to start the process of getting input to help start crafting and defining what will ultimately turn into the commitments in this new National Action Plan. And this will be coupled with convenings, meetings like this, typically roughly every month. We have not set the date for the next one, but you can expect that to occur within the next month or so, and we'll be posting that date as soon as possible. So here we are really just at the beginning with this first phase. And so just to give you a preview of what we are looking to start capturing as we officially kick things off with this first phase, with the beginning of the co-creation process beginning tomorrow, is we'll have a page on the Open Government website, which is open.usa.gov. And initially, we're really, as part of this first phase, looking to capture kind of these three things. So to help support the outreach, we're doing a lot of this ourselves, but we're also asking for your help to help us identify additional civil society organizations, communities, experts, and in particular, more inclusive voices to help us inform and engage them with a more diverse and robust co-creation process. And then we also want to capture existing research reports, recommendations, kind of landscape analysis, because we know we're not starting from scratch here. There's a lot of work that's already been done. There's existing national action plans that have come in the past with recommendations, some of which made it into those plans, some of which did not. So we want to make sure that we're sort of aware of what's already out there and what remains relevant. And so, yeah, we want to be thorough and thoughtful in capturing what's already out there. And then ultimately, the real substance of this process is defining the problem statements, understanding what open government can solve. So we're looking more for problem statements rather than solutions. That will come next. Although as people are providing problem statements, I'm sure that they will also, be tempted to include solutions. But really right now we're focused much more on making sure that we're clear in defining problems that open government can solve. So this is not live yet, this form to provide all of these different aspects of input, but this is expected to go live tomorrow on the Open Government website, which will kind of formally kick off this first phase of the co-creation process. And then to give a little bit of a preview of kind of the multiple phases of co-creation and what this initial kind of broad effort of kind of capturing at a high level outreach, research, problem statements. The next phase is meant to sort of help shape these problem statements into more thematic focus areas, at which point we'll have much more deeper dialogue and engagement, in particular with relevant civil society organizations and communities that are kind of key stakeholders for those thematic focus areas. And just to give some examples of what some of these thematic focus areas could be, and we don't want to predefine these, this is just to give you an idea of how these have been defined in the past by other efforts, from the Open Government Partnership and the Open Government Declaration, which every Open Government Partnership member is a party to. These four kind of areas of open government have been kind of highlighted as part of the Open Government Declaration. So things like increasing the availability of information about government activities, supporting civic participation, implementing the highest standards of professional integrity throughout our administrations, and increasing access to new technologies for openness and accountability. Just additional examples also from the Open Government Partnership in terms of kind of policy areas that they define as common sort of key thematic areas. I've listed a number of those here as well, just as, again, just as examples or references for the kinds of ways that we may start thinking about sort of shaping some of the initial input of problem statements into thematic areas. And then from the US government context, also just some examples of some thematic areas that are already defined through some existing frameworks, from the White House priorities to the President's management agenda. I've listed some of those here as well. And then additionally, as part of the Summit for Democracy process, there's a number of domestic kind of focused commitments that have been outlined there, which again is just another reference point for thinking through, where there is existing work that's in place that could inform or could be opportunities to bolster or critique ideas as far as informing new commitments. And again, there's a very long list of the commitments that are as part of the Summit for Democracy. So, so that was sort of just a preview of kind of what to expect as we launch this first phase of the co-creation process, this kind of effort to collect this initial set of input. This first phase, we will not be responding to every input that comes in. This first phase is intended to kind of help collect to do this landscape analysis. Once we're kind of collecting those into these thematic areas, that's when we will have deeper engagement with workshops and have much more of the bidirectional dialogue to shape those into the new commitments. That is not to say that there will not be dialogue and continued engagement throughout this process, but just considering the potential volume of ideas that we may receive, and the purpose is not for us to be responding to each of these in this initial phase. It's just to get to the kind of helping to define the contours of these kind of thematic areas, which will then be the kind of opportunity to focus for deeper dialogue. So I think I had it part of the agenda to stop for a moment for some quick Q&A before we go to the next part of the agenda. But if it's okay, I think I'll hold that for the end of this meeting and hand off the mic to Lisa Rosenberg from Open the Government. And one of the reasons I wanted to invite Lisa is to acknowledge that, again, we're not starting from scratch here, that there's a lot of existing input and feedback and recommendations from civil society to inform these commitments. And so we wanted to provide opportunities to hear from some organizations and coalitions that have been already thinking about this a lot and have already been putting a lot of work into developing recommendations and helping to inform commitments like those we may be looking to include in this National Action Plan. So with that, I will hand the mic over to Lisa, if that's okay with you, Lisa.
Absolutely. And I just put a link in the chat, I think. Yes, that is what Phil was referring to. It's what we call our blueprint for accountability and what I'll be talking about for a little bit today. So first, I do want to thank you all, Phil and everybody, for the opportunity to share some thoughts as the U.S. embarks on the 5th National Action Plan for Open Government, and provide recommendations, for a possible starting point, which is this blueprint for accountability that Phil mentioned, and a way for the U.S. government to demonstrate that this process is one which really values the priorities of civil society. As background, I am the executive director of Open the Government. We are a coalition of more than 100 organizations that advocates for accountability in order to strengthen democracy. In early 2020, we convened around 40 of our coalition partners and other organizations to create recommendations for what we hoped would be a new administration to address the accountability problems that we as a group collectively agreed to prioritize. And I know, Phil, you mentioned that you'll be looking for problem statements. We did that. So we developed, as you said, the problems and the solutions, and I'll show you some examples in the chat in a little bit. But the result of really what was a year's worth of work of these organizations was what was called Accountability 2021. At the end of 2021, we realized we needed to change the name, so we call it the Blueprint for Accountability now. But the original document was 90 pages of recommendations for a new administration. And it was, to use OGP terms, I think, a very successful co-creation process with input and agreement from many of the top experts and organizations in the accountability field. The focus was on executive branch reforms, on the theory that we didn't need 60 votes in the Senate to get these things done. In the end, we, again, collectively as a group, agreed to include some legislative recommendations, couching them as recommendations we would certainly hope that the administration would support. Again, as a group, we focused on, we picked the issue areas we wanted to look at. The first one was, in fact, open government. We also addressed ethics, balance of power, whistleblower protections, regulatory reform, and later we decided we needed to include a pandemic response, a chapter in that, in our work. a lot of the recommendations that are outside of the open government chapter or bucket also, not surprisingly, deal with open government. You should know that. The recommendations, the way we drafted it, were actions that we wanted to see a new administration do on day one, first 100 days, and then longer term actions. And we really wanted to focus on actionable items. So we created draft EO language, for example, and really things that, agencies or, folks in the executive branch could just take and tweak and then implement it quickly and easily. And we really wanted to make it a very kind of, we had the problems and the principles, but then we wanted sort of practical solutions. And that was really, really important. We started working with administration officials, during the transition, and we've been, advocating for some of these, advocating for these changes ever since. I have to say that progress has been slow at best. I'll put a link in to the open government chapter right now. And I will tell you that we had over 40 open government recommendations, I think, in the initial document. And by our measure and tracking, really only 5 have been implemented so far. Now, look, we know that this administration had a lot on its plate, early in its, or when President Biden first took office. And we recognize that. And I think as a community, we've been patient. It took over a year for the Department of Justice to issue a Freedom of Information Act memo. It also took a lot of advocacy by the Open Gov community and Congress to, I think, make sure that actually happened. That's the kind of thing that we would have hoped would have happened on day one, the kind of thing we thought of as sort of a no-brainer to guide agencies to embrace transparency. But better late than never. And so how I would view kind of our slow progress so far, if I'm being optimistic, is that the slow start on the Blueprint for Accountability recommendations means that there is a ready-made starting point for the National Action Plan process. And I really do appreciate the fact that one of the stages of this process is to collect, recommendations like ours and others, and kind of start from there. I've said this a lot of times to Phil and to others. There isn't a need to reinvent the wheel, and so we're appreciative of the fact that it doesn't seem like this process is completely starting from scratch, which I think is really good and really important. I would add a caveat just about our own work and just sort of a word of a warning or advice as you are embarking on this National Action Plan. When we created the Blueprint for Accountability, we as a small nonprofit organization just weren't able to engage organizations outside the Beltway in any meaningful way. And we didn't have, in my opinion, enough organizations working in the fields of civil rights and civil liberties in the room. We had a few, but I don't think that, that from my perspective, I think we needed more of those voices in the room, and they were critical. And so, as this NAP stage is going forward, that would be something that I would highly recommend you really focus on, because I do think that there'll be different priorities, obviously, than sort of the inside the Beltway accountability community would advance. That all being said, though, for the civil society groups that did work on the Blueprint for Accountability, implementing even some of the recommendations that we made in the blueprint would give us hope that this will be a serious and meaningful effort. And I think that we will feel much more encouraged, having worked, on national action plans in the past, that if the effort takes a look at some of the harder recommendations in the Blueprint for Accountability, and really tries to advance those. I think that you'll see a lot of support from civil society. If the administration, either does start from scratch or focuses only on, let's call it, the low-hanging fruit, I think civil society is not going to be as enthusiastic about this effort. So I would encourage folks to look at the blueprint. I would encourage folks to reach out to to racial equity organizations and get their take and their priorities, which I will admit will probably be different than what we have now, and go from there. And happy to answer any questions if there are any. And thank you again for the opportunity to share our work with you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Yeah, we have plenty of time to open the floor for questions to Lisa, or questions more broadly. Let me see if there's anything in the chat. I don't see anything.
Well, I have a question. Steve
Okay.
Buckley.
And sorry, just if you don't mind, before you start, Stephen, if we could hold questions to less than 1 to 2 minutes, if possible.
About 10 seconds.
No problem.
Not long enough? Oh, okay. Is there a, I'm wondering with Lisa's organization, how that fits into the guidelines or the plan or whatever. I was wondering how it is that there's a group that represents ostensibly other groups, even though there are 100 in the Open the Government Coalition. I could probably come up with 1,000 if I really looked. So I don't see any reference to a special status for any one group to speak for others within the OGP planning process. Thanks.
That's very good feedback. And I'm still finalizing the exact language for the prompts for the input that will be on the form tomorrow. But I think the intent for input in this process is for us to encourage input to come from groups of people, so from civil society organizations or community groups. Obviously, we're not going to limit input to those, but that is, I think, what we are encouraging to provide, to encourage civil society to do what civil society does, and to be organized, and to help sort of provide some of that consensus and kind of stakeholder engagement within civil society. It also obviously makes this process a lot more manageable, as opposed to soliciting lots of input from different individuals on their own. So I think that is. Does that answer your question, Stephen?
I think it's an item for further discussion, so we'll leave it at that. And I was looking for a reference within the OGP protocol, but we can.
Yeah. So I don't know if we have anyone from the Open Government Partnership Support Unit with us today who could answer that. But my understanding is the intent for this process is really for there to be a well-organized civil society counterpart to this process, to have organizations and coalitions of organizations to really help to provide sort of that kind of coordination and organization to support the development of the commitments. That said, that is still I think some of a amorphous kind of ecosystem in many ways. Some other countries have much more, I think, articulately established multi-stakeholder forums, as we've heard from past meetings from examples like Canada. That is not in place, to the same extent here. So I think that is still sort of a work in progress. And I think to Lisa's point, I think as this process continues, I think we have to sort of to learn from it and to sort of prove what works and sort of get that structure in place in a way that makes sense for our context here. So I guess more to come on that, but I appreciate the question, and I think it's something we can continue to explore and work on. And I see two other hands raised. Alex Howard.
Thank you so much, Phil. I know that you've been working super hard to make this happen for a long time, and I really appreciate the careful, thoughtful explanation at the top of this and the clarity with which you've laid out the timeline and what's happening. I'm not sure if maybe you missed the question in the chat earlier, so I'll just redo it. I know dual monitors and tech gets in the way. This is for AMAC. There's been a really great, I think, engagement around the effort to create a Bill of Rights for an automated society, the so-called AI Bill of Rights that OSTP has been pioneering or trying to push forward, building on work in past administrations. That work was supported with a blog post, social media, a Federal Register notice, op-eds, a lot of engagement and consultations that have, I think, pulled in diverse voices. And I haven't seen the same support from the White House for this process. So to build on what Lisa was saying about good faith, I'm wondering if we're going to see OSTP and OMB and EOP introduce this to the public so that there's a lot more surface area for this and encourage a more diverse set of stakeholders beyond the ones that have been coming to these public meetings, which, as you know, have primarily been promoted through the Open Government mailing list. I know that getting coverage of this as a process into a lot more publications outside of the Beltway and some of the more inside baseball trade publications might include a lot of the folks. And I'm sorry, Stacy, I meant Alexander McGillivray, the deputy CTO from White House who's with us. I was asking a question to him, since we have someone from the White House here, about how and where they're going to support this publicly to bring in a lot more voices. Because I think that Phil and GSA are doing a great job creating the platform, and I'm wondering how we're going to fill it up with the voices of a lot of Americans. So thanks for the chance to weigh in. You know, there's a lot of opportunity here, and I'm excited that you all are re-engaging on it.
Thanks, Alex. I appreciate the kind words about the AI Bill of Rights, something that certainly we're excited about here. And I appreciate what I take to be mostly a comment more than a question, that we should be doing more to lift up the work that is going on in terms of open government, and certainly something that I'll take back and think on how we can do that.
Thanks, Alex. Thank you both, Alexes. Yeah, and I also, I mean, the conversations about this are really kind of the main goal that I had for this meeting, is to have these types of conversations, because let me remind you, the first phase of the co-creation process, which technically kicks off tomorrow, is outreach. And so that is, you know, roughly a month-long process that we really want to dedicate to outreach. You know, I'm going to be totally honest, I don't have as much of a robust comms plan ready to kick off tomorrow as I would like to have, but this is not a one-day thing. This is a month-long, you know, first phase of outreach. So, and one of the first things that we're looking for input and help from you all on is recommendations on not just, you know, taking advantage of the visibility in the bully pulpit of the White House, but also, you know, having some of those more personal points of contact that we can reach out to and really kind of bring them into the process in a more intimate and trusted way. So really welcome, you know, additional feedback on how to sort of be more inclusive and reach these audiences that are not aware of or not normally part of this process. So thank you all for your comments and thoughts on this. I think the next question is Daniel Schuman.
Yes, hi. I am sorry, everyone, that my name is not, in fact, Alex, because that would have made it a lot more fun. But thank you all for hosting this conversation. Lisa, of course, it's good to see you. I enjoyed your presentation, as always. So I'm going to do a question as a question instead of a question as a comment. I hope that is all right. That was the question part. No, just kidding. In terms of looking at the far end of this. So we go through this process, we end up with a series of recommendations that we co-create together. When do you have an expectation for when that would actually, like, when would we end up with a set of items that the administration would be interested and committed potentially to implementing? And because I'm looking at that in the context of the legislative calendar, administration support for changing things in law, and of course, what happens in the political world changes based upon factors outside of all of our control. So it helps think through what we recommend in part by what's feasible, and feasibility depends on the timeline for outcomes. So I'm hoping that you could speak to that a little bit. Thank you.
I'm certainly happy to speak to that. I don't know, AMAC, Alex, if you want to comment on any of that before I do, otherwise happy to do my best. So the timeline that's laid out for the co-creation process concludes with the final clearance and publication of the new plan, which is scheduled for, the process itself is scheduled to conclude in September. The timeline, the Open Government Partnership all member countries follow the same 2-year or potentially 4-year cycle. So we actually are going to be fixed to an implementation phase that technically will begin January 1st, 2023. However, there is flexibility in beginning implementation. I think it's up to maybe 6 months, or there is the option to begin implementation before that. And I think that is a conversation that we can continue to keep front and center throughout this process, particularly to your point about being mindful of the practicalities of whether it's the legislative calendar or other national priorities that set schedule, unexpectedly. I think another relevant point here is the engagement of other branches of government. Again, I don't think that we have anyone from the Open Government Partnership Support Unit on, but I know that they have been doing a lot more work lately to engage parliamentary legislative bodies in this process. I've done a little bit of that. Attempted to do a little bit of that myself. I don't think I've been as successful as I'd hoped to fully engage the legislative or certainly the judicial branch in this process. But I think that's another part of this question, and certainly welcome input and feedback on sort of how to include those people and concerns as part of this co-creation process. Yeah, does that answer your question?
It does in part. I think this is, I will avoid going into the comment portion of the question, but I would suggest that as agencies are thinking through their budget justifications and as they're identifying the priorities that they wish to raise with the administration, that it would be useful to try to sync up what we're doing here with what happens there. The only other thing, and this is actually a question, as was the other thing, as opposed to the interstitial matter, which was more of a suggestion. For a long time, there were a number, certainly under the Obama administration, there were a number of regular meetings between civil society and in the administration as part of its national action plan. I'm wondering, this may be, I don't know whether this falls within the ambit of what you're trying to accomplish here, or maybe outside. But if it's inside, certainly that was something that was useful for us. And I know that we would be happy to participate in that type of process again. I'm curious whether that fits in with what you're trying to do here, or whether the responsibility for those quarterly meetings that happen with civil society and the monthly meetings that happen inside the government, whether that's inside this process or whether that's something in parallel.
it is part of this process, but just to be frank, it is not staffed as much as it should be. But there are certainly a number of members of the interagency open government community who I believe are here present today on the call. So it's not just me and AMAC. There's certainly a number of other of the wonderful people, wonderful civil servants doing open government work across the interagency here as well. We have not had the internal interagency working group meetings as regularly as we used to. We're overdue for one. Hoping to have the next one very shortly, and I think as part of that process, I think we can line up civil society guests to focus on those meetings as well. So yeah, the short answer is it is all part of the same process, but it's a work in progress.
It's very helpful. Thank you. And I will not step in someone else, but we would be glad to participate if and when those get stood up again.
Sounds good. Thank you. Is that another question from Alex Howard, or is that your hand from before?
It's another question, but I don't want to step in front of someone else if there's more questions.
Okay, so there is a feature in Zoom for people to raise their hand, but if it's not obvious how to use that, you are welcome to unmute yourself and speak up and ask a question, or ask in chat. And I think there may be some questions in chat. So there is a comment from the Open Government Partnership Support Unit, just mentioning that they do have new guidance on inclusive co-creation and parliamentary collaboration that we'd be happy to share and participate after this call. Thank you, Allison, for highlighting that. Okay, with that, I think over to you, Alex.
So I've got three different questions here. One goes directly to Allison's point. Some of the great research OGP has done on what makes OGP successful in different countries is top-down leadership from a world leader, so that they're actually telling all of their people about it and showing that they're personally involved. And we're hoping to see that from the president. The second thing that's very important is the involvement of Parliament, in this case, Congress. So then the question might be, will the White House's legislative staff be engaging Congress about any of this process, or will Congress itself be involved, say with the Modernization Committee, which has a pretty ready-made agenda for open government? Then the other two questions, and these were in the chat, so they're memorialized there if you want to go back and check them. Should we expect, and this is for Alex and the White House, if the process is like the last 4 OGP cycles, which I participated in through the whole way, the finalized plan is going to end up being run through the National Security Council to be signed off on. Will AMAC be the senior official? Will you be the senior official accountable for that? Or will that be Justin Vail? Like who is the person in the White House that we should expect to be shepherding that process? And what kind of commitments can you all publicly make that might help some of our more skeptical civil society partners or organizations feel like this is something that they can depend on in terms of having some of the recommendations, some of the ideas that have been put out there be in the final plan and make it through that process. And as part of that, I guess the third follow-up there, will the White House itself show some good faith by restoring its own open government page? If you look at the Obama White House site, which is on archives.gov, you can see all of what used to be there. If you go to many of the agencies across government, you can see they have a /open page that points back to whitehouse.gov/open. Would you all be willing to set that up and kind of list what the White House is doing, and then to refer to this plan so that people across government and also the American people can see how all of these things are connected and understand how they fit together?
think those were all directed to me. So let me see if I can remember what they all were and try to respond. The first question was, I think, around whether we will do legislative affairs work from the White House Legislative Affairs Office, or whether we expect the legislative branch to do their own work with respect to OGP. I don't know what the right answer to that is, so I'll have to get back to folks on that. And I'll take the other question, the other easy question first, which was, will we restore our own open government page? I think the best way to handle this, these types of things, Alex, is what I think we're trying to do, and what Phil has been methodical about, is trying to understand the types of things that you all think are important in this process, and to prioritize those things in terms of the lift on our end to get them done. Certainly, if that were the #1 priority, is restoring a web page, that sounds like a thing that we can get done. But the thing I'd rather do is try to go through what are the things that are going to have the biggest impact on us doing the right thing in terms of open government work, and try to prioritize those things first. So I'm maybe that's not the most helpful answer, but trying to do it in a more methodical way, rather than sort of off the cuff on the phone call. In terms of exactly how this process is going to run in this administration, I don't know. I think in terms of the person whose throat you can choke, certainly mine is the right one, particularly at the present time. And the commitments that we are trying to come through is, again, with Phil's good shepherding, to try to give back to this community an understanding of the things that we think we can get to the finish line, rather than front load with, here's a thing that we know we can do now, which may not be where we actually get to. So Alex, I don't know if you wanted to follow up, and I'm still on the call for a while. We can also do this offline, but in terms of throat you can choke, certainly that's mine. That's an easy question to answer. The other stuff is a little bit more complex.
Yeah, I'll follow up offline. I don't mean to say that any web page is a #1 priority. It's more about whether the White House is able to symbolically say, this is something we care about. This is something that our staff care about. This is something that we as an institution are committed to. Here's what the president said about this. Here's what we're doing about it. Here is the agency coordinating this consultation. Here are all the ways that we are trying to use facts and transparency and public engagement, participation and collaboration. And here's how we're showing our work, because we understand that a lot of you may not feel that much trust in us as an institution. And we don't want to just see necessarily a fact sheet, but like showing your work as you work against these things. So if there's this progress report from the blueprint, here are the things that we're doing in response.
Yeah, and I think you see that in the way we're trying to conduct ourselves with respect to these meetings, and in how Phil has taken the day-to-day lead of this, and how I'm trying to be present and through this process as well. But those are all good comments. Thank you.
Thank you. I see Lisa, do you have your hand up?
Yeah, just a quick response, really echoing what Alex said, and kind of, again, we are a coalition of open government advocates, accountability advocates. That said, I don't want to pretend to speak for all of them, but I think I have a pretty good sense when I say that a show of good faith on these issues is really something we as a community need. I think it was missing during the first year of the administration. Certainly, again, the commitments to openness and transparency that didn't happen on day one or the first 100 days And again, I think we were patient, we understood, and COVID, and there was a lot going on. But I think this could be viewed really as a restart for this administration to really outwardly, wholeheartedly demonstrate its commitment to openness and transparency and accountability. So I really just wanted to kind of add that and emphasize that.
Thanks, Lisa. Stephen?
Yeah, I think there's an issue that needs to be addressed before the same thing happens all over again. Groundhog Day, deja vu all over again, whatever. The idea being that open government started on day one of the Obama administration, morphed a couple years later into the open government as a member of the Open Government Partnership. And I went to virtually all the meetings. I had to, thankfully I don't have to get on a plane from Boston to come down to a 1-hour meeting. And I had been pushing for, yes, video conferencing. So yay, finally. It took COVID, it took an actual virus in order for video conferencing to go viral. So silver lining of COVID. Anyway, what I'm trying to get to is that this needs to be more than inside the Beltway, which is what it was. And I say that as somebody who spent 25 years in DC working for 5 different agencies involving civic engagement. And it needs to not repeat the mistakes of the 8 years and then 4 years of Trump, which I'm surprised it still exists. But anyway, this needs to be more inclusive of people outside, and not just, I'll join your coalition if you join my coalition, here's our blueprint. And certainly freedom of assembly, anybody can do that, but I would like the understanding that there are lessons to be learned and that have not been learned or acknowledged before going forward and repeating those same mistakes again. And that is that it needs to be more. One of those things is that, oh, we didn't have a way to evaluate. We were totally caught off guard by the Trump phenomena. Oh, who knew? I tried to say, people, no, public trust is going down, has been going down for many years. People are frustrated. Oh, but Obama's got so many followers on Twitter. That's the wrong metric. So I'm just a little frustrated. I hope that there's some acknowledgement of what was missed before, not as a way to point fingers, but as a way to learn and do better this time. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. Yeah, a key focus of this first phase is inclusive, proactive, diverse outreach to get outside the Beltway. So I know that's not obvious or visible from perhaps a lot of the people that are here on the call today, but I also welcome your input and help to help expand the community here. But certainly we're doing a lot of that ourselves, and look forward to the next couple of months having a more diverse and inclusive set of participants in this practice.
Just at one point, I'm not going to invite anybody to the same thing because I have a certain amount of credibility myself. And if I need to see something that shows me that it's going to be worth it for me to extend my credibility and say, hey, this is really worth it this time. Because a lot of people were involved in the very beginning of open government under Obama, and then it petered out. And so there's going to have to be something because I'm not going to, yes, I have a certain amount of social capital and I have to be careful with it. And I'm going to need to see something before I tell people about this. So, and I want to be able to tell people about it, but not if it's just going to be the same old thing. It has to be something that really shows that something's different this time. Thank you.
I see a hand from Susan Harley.
Hey there, Susan Harley with Public Citizen. I apologize. I had to join a little bit late, so I think you may have covered this in the beginning part, but I am unclear. It seems as if you're currently going through a process of going through the previous national action plans and determining which items have been completed or not completed. Will that prioritize the uncompleted items to the top of the list, or will there be another analysis of, is this actually the goal of the community still? And so there will be some ability to deprioritize things that may have been on a previous plan, but no longer are at the top of the list of the of civil society.
So good question. This first phase is meant to sort of to be pretty comprehensive and inclusive of both recognizing some past commitments or recommendations for commitments, but also brand new ones. So there is a process for reviewing and having status updates on previous commitments. Currently, those aren't all visible on the Open Government website, or sorry, on the open.usa.government website. We're working on a refresh of the website. We're hope to have the whole history of all prior commitments' current status. However, that is visible on the Open Government Partnership website. And initially, some of that is, will actually be essentially copying and pasting some of that over to our website, but then adding and updating relevant information on some of those past commitments. But yeah, I think to answer your question, this first phase is to account for both prior recommendations that had already been, effort was put in to develop prior recommendations, or commitments were made and maybe were partially completed. So those are meant to be part of the kind of landscape analysis or the research of this initial phase, but also brand new problem statements, brand new things that are perhaps more reflective of the current context of the world and the country at the moment. So
That's great. I appreciate that. Just like a follow-up thing, I think I recall like Freedom of Information Act improvements were part of one of the first national action plans. And so whatever, since there has been a reform to that law since then, that if there were specific recommendations, just, FOIA itself still needs to be improved, but the recommendations underneath would have changed. So anyway, happy to help when that time comes to look at what the lay of the land currently is.
okay, sounds good. Thanks. Well, we will definitely to continue to follow up on pulling that information together and making it more clear. All right. Do we have any other questions? I think I maybe had one or two last slides before I do, but they're not. I'll just share my screen for the sake of it, just to kind of close us out here. So the next steps. Tomorrow, the form to start soliciting those 3 points, the outreach, the research, and the problem statements. Those will be live. So we'll send out a reminder about that. And so that will really kick off the co-creation process, particularly this first phase. And we expect to have another one of these public meetings roughly a month from now. There may be more than one meeting in June. We're still working out the schedule, but we will keep you all updated. And I think that pretty much closes us out for the day. And yeah, I really appreciate everyone joining today and look forward to continuing this process with you all, as well as a lot more new faces in the coming weeks and months. So good to see you all. And I think with that, we are good to wrap up for the day. But thank you again, and look forward to seeing you all again soon. Take care, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you.